The first thing I noticed about the woman driving the boat was that she didn't look at us when we came down the ramp, and I took that for what men like me always take it for: rudeness, or nerves, or the particular smallness of somebody who's been handed a job too big and is trying not to show it. I was wrong on all three counts, but it would take me the rest of that day and a good many years after to understand how wrong. We were 11 that morning on the loading dock at Firebase Halloway, my recon element of 8, plus a signals attachment of 2, plus me. Staff Sergeant Cole Vance, 6 years in, most of them spent believing I could read a person in the first 10 seconds. I read her in the first 2. Medium build, dark hair pulled back hard under a faded ball cap gone the color of river mud, sleeves rolled to the forearm, a plate carrier that had been someone's a long time before it was hers, and looked it. She stood at the wheel of a patrol boat that had more patches than paint, and she was checking something down along the gunnel with the flat, unhurried attention of a person counting change. "That's the driver," Corporal Reynoso said next to me. "Lo, the way you say a thing you mean to be overheard by everyone except the person it's about." "That's the driver," I said. We'd been told a coxswain would run us up the Marin to the drop point above Villa Ford, put us on the east bank in the dark before dawn, and be waiting at the same bend to pull us off 26 hours later. That was the whole of it. Nobody had said a name. Nobody at the fire base had said much of anything about her, and when men don't talk about someone, you assume there's nothing to say. That's the assumption that gets people killed, but I didn't know that yet either. The boat was a low, ugly thing, a riverine patrol craft that had been up and down the delta so many times the aluminum had a memory of every sandbar. Twin guns forward, one aft, armor plate bolted on in slabs that didn't match. It sat in the brown water like it belonged there more than we did. She had 2 crew, a young bowman with a farmer's sunburn, and an older engineer down in the well who never came up the whole trip. And she ran the 3 of them the way a good hand runs a team of horses, without seeming to do anything at all. I put my boot on the deck and she still didn't look at me. She said to the air, center of the boat, not the sides, "If we take fire, I don't want you shifting the trim." Her voice was even and quiet and carried anyway. It was the voice of somebody used to being obeyed by people who didn't know they were obeying. Reynoso rolled his eyes at me. I let him. I was thinking about the 26 hours ahead, the east bank, the tree line we'd have to cross, the reason a recon element was going up past Villa Ford at all, which was that something was moving supplies through that stretch at night, and command wanted eyes on it before they wanted anything else. I was thinking about my men. I was not thinking about the boat driver, except to file her under a category I'd used 100 times. Local asset, low skill, keep clear of the real work. "You always talk to the deck instead of the people on it," Reynoso said, grinning, wanting a rise. She finally looked up. She had a plain, weathered face, older than I'd guessed at first, with eyes the color of the river and about as easy to see the bottom of. She looked at Reynoso for exactly as long as it took to decide he wasn't worth an answer, and then she looked back at her gunwale. "Ropes off," she said to the bowman. And we went. The Marin in the last dark before dawn is a road made of water, and she drove it like a road she'd built herself. I've been on a lot of boats run by a lot of men, and most of them fight the river. They haul the wheel, they gun the throttle, they slam through the chop and call it seamanship. She didn't fight anything. She read it. I sat amidships where she'd put me and I watched her hands because there was nothing else to watch, and after the first half hour I stopped being bored and started, against my will, being interested. She never once looked at the water directly ahead. She looked at it 30, 40 meters out, at the sheen of it, the little wrinkles where the current dragged over a bar, the darker seams where the channel ran deep. She'd ease the wheel a hand's width and the boat would slide across to a line I couldn't see and hadn't known was there, and only afterward, when we passed the place, would I see the pale hump of a sandbar just under the surface where we would have grounded. She did it again, and again. She was reading the river the way a sniper reads ground, and she was doing it in the dark, from memory and from the color of the water, at a speed that should have put us hard aground a dozen times and didn't once. The bowman, the sunburned kid, caught me watching. "First time up the Marin?" he asked. "First time this far." He nodded like that explained me. "She's run it more'n anybody alive," he said, and there was a thing in his voice I didn't have a word for then. It wasn't pride, exactly. It was closer to the way you talk about whether that saved your life. "How long she been driving boats?" I asked, and I said driving on purpose to see. The kid looked at me a second. Then he looked back at his gun and said, "Long time." In the flat way she'd said center of the boat, and I understood I'd stepped on something without knowing where the edge was. We ran on. The sky went from black to the color of a bruise to a gray that let me finally see the banks, the reed walls, the drowned trees, the little stilt houses back in the green with cook smoke starting to rise. Twice she cut the throttle to nearly nothing and let us idle silent past a stretch where the reeds came close, and both times she did it before I saw any reason to, and both times when we cleared, I noticed a spot back in the green that could have hidden a man and a gun, a spot I'd never have picked at speed. She wasn't nervous. She was economical. Every single thing she did cost her exactly what it was worth and not one motion more. I'd have told you that morning that I was the professional aboard and she was the taxi. If you'd made me swear to it, I would have. That's the part I think about most now, how certain I was, and how the certainty had nothing under it but the shape of her job and the color of her hat. An hour above Vila Ford she brought us in toward the east bank at a place where the reeds broke and a mudflat ran up under the trees. She'd throttled down so gradually I hadn't felt a slow. The bow kissed the mud without a sound. "Bank's soft for 6 feet, then it's firm," she said, still not loud. "Go straight up, don't cut left, there's a channel. I'll be at the second bend below here in 26 hours, first light or your emergency freak, whichever's first." She finally turned and looked at the whole 11 of us, one pass the way you'd count a load before you sign for it. "Whatever happens up there," she said, "when you come back down that bank, you come to the water. Don't stop at the tree line and wait to be pretty about it. You come to the water, and I'll do the rest." Reynoso muttered something to the man beside him. I saw her hear it. She didn't react. "Copy," I said, because somebody had to, and I was the somebody. We went up the bank and into the green, 11 men on a job, and behind us the ugly boat backed off the mud and vanished into the reeds without a wake, and I put her out of my mind entirely, which is the last dumb thing I did before the day taught me better. The east bank of the Marin above Vila Ford is bad country to move in and worse to hide in, and we spent the daylight learning both. We crossed the mudflat, went up through the tree line the way she'd said, straight, not left, and found the channel she'd promised, a game trail worn firm under a foot of standing water that let us move without cutting sign in the mud. I noticed that. I filed it under lucky and kept going. We laid up through the heat in a stand of drowned timber a click and a half back from the river, and I put my men on the tree line, and we watched the road that ran along the far edge of the paddies toward Vila Ford, and we waited for the dark, because whatever was moving through that stretch moved at night. It came at night. Just past 2 in the morning, headlights that weren't headlights, the covered slit lamps of trucks running blacked out, 4 of them, nose to tail, crawling the road with men walking the flanks. Reynoso had the count. Belanger had the glass. I had the radio, and I called it back to Holloway in the clipped half-words we used, grid and heading and load, and command came back wanting more, wanting us to hold and confirm the offload point, which meant another night, which meant staying. We stayed. That was my call, and it was the right call, and I'd make it again. And it is also the call that turned a 26-hour insertion into the worst 40 hours of my life, and hers. Because the second night they had a security element out, and the security element was better than the trucks, and at some gray hour before the second dawn, one of their flankers walked a loop wider than we'd planned for and came up on Belanger's side of our hide, and there was a look, a single frozen look between a man of theirs and a man of mine, and then the country came apart. I won't tell it slow. It didn't happen slow. In 4 minutes we went from a recon element nobody knew was there to 11 men running for a river with the whole east bank waking up behind us. Belanger took a round through the meat of the thigh in the first 30 seconds. Two of the signal's attachment got separated, and we got them back only because Reynoso went back into the green after them with a disregard for himself I have never properly thanked him for. We broke contact the way you trained to, and it still cost us. We came out of that tree line strung over 60 meters. 3 men hurt. One of them bad, ammunition bleeding away with every step, and behind us the sound of an enemy that had stopped being surprised and started being organized. I got on the emergency freak while I ran. I keyed it and I said the words you never want to say, the words that mean the plan is dead and all that's left is getting bodies to safety. Any station, this is recon element on the Marin East Bank. We are compromised. We are moving to primary extract. We have wounded. We need that boat at the bend now, say again now. And her voice came back. It came back so fast and so level that for a second I thought I'd imagined it, because I'd braced for the 20 seconds of dead air that means the other person is scrambling. There was no scramble. She'd been up. She'd been listening. She'd probably been listening the whole 2 days, sitting in the reeds in that ugly boat, and when I said now her voice was already there, flat and even and utterly without fear, and it did more to steady the 11 of us than anything I said the whole rest of the night. Recon element, this is your boat. I'm coming up to the bend. Get to the water. I say again, get to the water, don't hold at the trees. What's your worst hurt? Gunshot upper thigh, we're carrying him, I said, chest heaving. And we're going to come out hot. There's a lot of them behind us. A pause, 1 beat. The length of a person looking at a river she knew by heart and deciding something. Understood, she said. Come to the water. We came to the water. We came the way she'd told us not to be pretty about. A broken sprint down through the same tree line we'd gone up. Men falling and getting hauled up. Belanger between 2 of us with his arms over our shoulders and his boots barely finding the ground. The emergency freak squawking. And behind and above us the crack and the snap of rounds finding the branches. We broke out onto the mudflat in the first gray light, and there was the river, wide and brown and blessed. And there, coming up fast and low along the far reeds with a white tier of wake behind her, was the ugly boat. And I understood, in the 2 seconds it took her to close the distance, that I had spent 2 days being a fool. Because she brought that boat into the bank under fire the way she'd read the sandbars in the dark, without hurry, without a wasted inch, laying it against the mud at exactly the angle that gave her guns the tree line and gave us the shortest run to the ramp. And she'd already started her forward gun working the green above us before the hull touched, short controlled bursts, not spray, walking rounds along the places a shooter would be. And I heard the enemy fire slacken where her gun spoke, and I thought, clear as a bell in all that noise. She has done this before. She has done this exact thing before, and often, and it is the men shooting at us who ought to be afraid. We loaded hot. It is an ugly, frantic thing, loading wounded onto a boat under fire, and she did not once tell us to hurry, which is the thing I remember. A lesser hand would have screamed at us. She ran her guns and she called the water. 2 more steps. He's in. Get down. Get to the center. And the whole time her voice stayed at the exact same pitch it had been on the loading dock 2 days before, and that steadiness poured out of her and into us, and we loaded 11 men and 3 of them wounded in under 90 seconds, because she made 90 seconds feel like enough. The bowman was hit. I saw it as I came over the gunwale, the sunburned kid, down on 1 knee at the forward gun with a dark stain spreading at his shoulder, still feeding the gun with 1 arm. She saw it the same instant I did. Vance, first time she'd used my name, I hadn't known she had it. Forward gun, you know it. I know it. Then it's yours. He's done. She said it flat, not cold, flat the way a surgeon is flat. The kid was already sliding down out of the seat and I was already sliding up into it. and she'd read the swap and adjusted the boat's trim for the shift of weight before I'd got my hands on the grips. And I felt the deck settle back level under me and understood she was accounting for every kilogram aboard in real time. The wounded, the dead weight, me, all of it, the way you'd balance a scale. We backed off the mud, the far bank lit up. They'd gotten guns down to the water, real guns now, not just riflemen. A heavy machine gun somewhere back in the green throwing tracer across the river in ropes, and a second one opening up from downstream from the direction of the bend below us, the direction we had to go, and I felt the whole day tilt toward the bad end. Because the bend below us was the only way down, and they had put a gun on it. She'd seen it before I had, of course she had. "They've corked the bend," she said to herself, to the crew, to me. "2 guns, one either side of the channel, and a bar between them the current runs over." She said it the way you'd read a map aloud. She was already turning us, not down toward the bend and the guns, but back up and across, into the deeper water, and every instinct I had screamed that she was taking us the wrong way, up into the country we just bled getting out of. "That's the wrong," I started. "It's not," she said. And then, because I think she knew that 11 frightened men needed one sentence they could hold on to, she said the only long thing she said the whole fight. "There's a dead ground line up the middle where their 2 guns can't both bear at once. I'm going to run it in pieces. When I turn, you fire the side I turn away from. Don't argue with the boat. The boat knows the river." I have thought about the next 11 minutes every day of my life since. She ran the middle of the Marin the way I imagine a great pianist plays, something too fast to think about. Not fast, exactly, but without any gap between knowing and doing. She had said she'd run it in pieces, and she ran it in pieces. A hard surge up into the deep channel where the far gun's tracer went behind us. A cut of the throttle that dropped us into a trough behind a sandbar I couldn't see and never did see, so that the downstream gun's rounds walked across the water where we would have been. A swing that put the ugly boat's armored flank between the near gun and the wounded men in the well, deliberately, taking the rounds on the plate she'd chosen to give them, because it was the plate that could take it. She was reading 2 guns and a river and a boatload of weight all at once, and she was doing it out loud only enough to keep us alive. Firing left, fire left. And I fired left. And I felt the forward gun buck under my hands, and I walked it into the green the way I'd seen her do it, short bursts, and somewhere in the 3rd or 4th of these, I stopped being a passenger who'd been handed a gun, and started being one more thing she was running, a tool in a hand that knew exactly what it held. Belanger was bleeding in the well. The engineer, the old one who'd never come up in 2 days, was up now on the aft gun, and I understood the crew was 3 people who had done this together enough times that they didn't need to talk. She turned. The old man fired the side she turned from. She turned back. I fired mine. It was a rhythm. She had made a rhythm out of a kill zone. The near gun found us anyway once. You cannot run a river forever without a gun finding you, and it found us on the 4th piece of her run. A long raking burst that walked up the water and across the bow, and I felt the boat take it. Felt the hits go into the plate like a hammer on a barrel, and one round came through where the plate didn't meet and took the young bowman, the sunburned kid, already hit, down in the well now, took him for good. I saw her see it. I saw the smallest thing cross her face, a tightening. Gone as fast as it came, and she did not stop, and she did not slow, and she did not make a sound. And I understood that she was carrying it and would carry it and would not let it into her hands, because her hands had 11 men in them, and grief is a weight you cannot afford on the water. She threaded us up past the first gun, and then she did the thing I will tell about for the rest of my life. The downstream gun, the one corking the bend below, was set on the inside of the curve where it could rake anything coming down the channel, and there was no way down except past it. She'd taken us up and across to buy the men above. Now she had to bring us back down through the very gauntlet she'd avoided, because up was where the enemy was and down was the only home. And she'd known that from the first second. The run-up hadn't been an escape. It had been a setup. She'd used the whole upper river to make the downstream gunners commit, to make them lean out and range on where they thought we'd break. And now, she turned us down and drove straight at the bend with the throttle open, straight at the corking gun, into the one line where an overhang of drowned trees on the near bank would screen us from the far gun for exactly the 4 seconds it would take to close. "Vance," she said, "when I say you have one burst, the near bank base of the leaning tree waterline, one burst, make it count. I can't give you two." I got the leaning tree in my sights. I could see now at this range the flat black shape of the gun in the roots, the men behind it swinging to bring it onto us. "Now," she said, and put the boat's nose down into the current, so the bow dropped and gave me a stable line for one heartbeat, one. And I fired the one burst into the base of the leaning tree at the water line, and the gun and the men behind it came apart, and she had already turned us before I knew if I'd hit, already reading the far gun's next rounds, already sliding the ugly boat down into the dead water below the bend where the current took us, and the guns could no longer bear. And then the reeds closed over the stern and the firing fell away behind us, and there was only the sound of the engine and the water and 11 men breathing, and 3 of them would never breathe past that day, and 8 of us were going home because of the woman at the wheel. She didn't celebrate. That's a thing I've noticed about the ones who are actually good at it. There's no whoop, no fist on the console, no turning around to see if you saw. She ran us 3 more bends down the Marin in the growing light before she trusted the distance, and only then did she throttle back to a cruise, and let the engineer come off the aft gun and go down to Belanger, and the other wounded with the medical kit. And only then did she look back over her shoulder once at the well of the boat where the sunburned kid lay under a poncho with the old engineer's spare shirt folded under his head. She looked for about 2 seconds, then she faced front and drove her boat. I climbed down out of the forward gun on legs that didn't want to hold me, and I went and knelt by Belanger and did what little I could with a tourniquet I should have loosened an hour before and hadn't been able to reach, and Reynoso was there, gray in the face, and neither of us said anything for a while. The boat ran smooth under us. The bank slid by. The sun came up over the delta the way it does, indifferent and gold, and turned the brown water to bronze, and I sat in the well of a boat I had 2 days ago dismissed, and I could not look at the back of the driver's head without something turning over in my chest. I went forward, I don't fully know why, to say something maybe, to apologize, though I didn't have the words yet and wouldn't for years. I came up beside her at the wheel and I stood there, and the town of Villa Ford came into view downstream, and past it, far off, the low gray shapes of Firebase Halloway home. "That was," I started. "Don't," she said, not harsh, just tired finally now that it was allowed. "Not yet, get me to the ramp first." So I shut up and I stood the rest of the way at the wheel beside her, and I watched her read the last miles of the river she'd read 1,000 times, and I only began to understand the size of what I'd been riding in the presence of. Firebase Halloway saw us coming a long way off. They'd heard the whole thing, it turned out. The emergency freak had been up on the command net the entire time, and the fire support cell had listened to 40 minutes of a boat running a corked bend under 2 heavy guns and had been able to do exactly nothing. No fires cleared, no bird in range, nothing but listen. And there is a particular silence that settles over men who have listened, helpless, to other men fight for their lives. It was that silence that met us at the ramp. A crowd of them, more than there was any reason to be, standing along the loading dock in the gold morning light, watching the ugly patched boat come in with its plating hammered bright where the rounds had scoured it, and its bow gun still smoking, and 11 men aboard, 3 of them under ponchos. She laid the boat against the dock as softly as she'd kissed the mud 2 days before. No hurry, no wasted inch. The medics came aboard first, and Belanger and the 2 other wounded went off on litters, and the 3 we'd lost went off after them slow, with the whole dock gone still, and hats coming off, and the sunburned kid went off last of his crew, and the old engineer walked beside the litter with his hand on the boy's chest the whole way up the ramp, and did not look at anyone. And then it was just her, throttling down, killing the engine, and the sudden enormous quiet of a boat that has stopped. A colonel was on the dock. I didn't know him, a fire support man, staff, the kind of officer a recon staff sergeant never has cause to meet. He'd come down from the operations center with a radio man still trailing a handset, and he stood at the top of the ramp looking down at the woman securing her boat, and I saw on his face something I hadn't seen on any face in that place in 2 days. I saw a man looking at somebody he could not account for. "Coxswain," he said, it was half a question. She came up the ramp. She'd taken off the faded ball cap to wipe her face, and her hair was gray at the temples in the daylight, older than the river had let me see, and she looked up at the colonel with the same river-colored eyes she'd looked at Reynoso with 2 days ago and found not worth an answer. "Sir," she said. The radio man beside the colonel had his hand set up. He was listening to something on the command net, and his face was doing something strange, and he touched the colonel's sleeve and said, "Lo, sir. Sir, the net, the fire support net, they're asking who ran the extract. The whole net. They want the call sign of whoever ran that bend." The colonel looked at her. "Coxswain," he said again, "what's your call sign?" And she was quiet for a moment. Not from drama. I have thought about this a long time. I think she was quiet because she'd spent 2 days being nobody, a driver, furniture, and there is a cost to putting the other thing back on. And she was counting that cost the way she counted everything exactly before she paid it. "Undertow," she said. I watched it land on the colonel. I watched it land on the radio man. I didn't understand it. The name meant nothing to me. I was recon. I didn't know the River War's own legends, but I understood their faces, and I understood the way the radio man's hand tightened on the handset, and I understood that I had spent 2 days calling a monument the boat driver. "Say that again," the colonel said, and his voice had changed. "Undertow," she said, "Senior Chief, I had the Marin crossing at the Halloway Relief 4 years back." She said it the way she said everything, flat and economical, no weight on it, and that was somehow worse, that she wouldn't even lean on it. "They stood me down off combat runs after. I've been running inserts and ferries since. This one came up short a coxswain. I took it." The radio man keyed his handset and passed it up, and I heard later from Reynoso, who was closer, what happened on the net, because Reynoso heard it in the open, out of the radio man's earpiece, in the dead quiet of that dock. He said the fire support net, which had been a low, steady churn of traffic all morning, had gone completely silent. He said the colonel keyed up and said the call sign, said, "Undertow ran your extract. She brought back 8 of 11 through the Vila Ford Bend." And then there was nothing. Nothing at all. He said for a good 5 or 6 seconds the busiest net on the firebase held a silence you could have stood a rifle up in. And then he said one voice came up. An old voice, a senior voice, somewhere up the chain. Somebody who'd been in the Delta long enough to know what the name meant. And all that voice said was the call sign. Once, slow, the way you say a name in a church. "Undertow." And then that voice said one more thing, and Reynoso, who is not a soft man, who went back into the green after 2 lost soldiers with rounds cracking past his head, Reynoso told me this part looking at the deck. The voice said, "We thought you were done. Understood. Welcome back to the water." And the net stayed silent after that. Nobody stepped on it. A whole net full of men who talk for a living, and not one of them would put his voice down on top of that quiet. She didn't hear most of it. She'd already turned back to her boat. That's the thing I keep coming back to. While the net that had ignored her existence for years said her name like a prayer, she'd gone back down the ramp, and she was crouched at the forward gun, at the place where the sunburned kid had been hit, wiping the boy's blood off the feed tray with a rag, slow, careful, the way you'd clean something you meant to give back. The colonel was standing there wanting to say something to her, and half the firebase was standing there having just learned who she was, and she was cleaning her gun and grieving her crewmen in the only way she'd let herself, with her hands, with the work, and asking nothing from any of us at all. I went down to her. I had to. I'd been the loudest fool aboard, and I owed her the words even if I didn't have them. "Senior Chief," I said. It felt strange and right in my mouth. "I called you the boat driver." She kept wiping the tray. "You did," she said. "I'm sorry." She stopped then. She looked up at me, and for the first time there was something almost like warmth in the river-colored eyes, though it was a hard warmth, the kind that costs something. "You loaded 11 men in 90 seconds and you put one burst into the base of that tree when one burst was all there was," she said. "You did your job. Don't spend today being sorry. Spend it being right the next time." She went back to the tray. "That's the only apology that matters on the water. I have tried to spend every day since being right the next time. I have not always managed it, but I have never again looked at a person doing a quiet, unglamorous job and assumed the quiet meant there was nothing there. That much she burned out of me for good in one morning on the Marin, without ever once raising her voice. They put her back on combat runs after that. The story went up the river faster than any boat, the way those stories do, and whatever had stood her down 4 years before couldn't stand against a whole fire support net that had heard what it heard. She ran the Delta another long while. I looked for her name after I rotated home and found it in more places than I'd have guessed. Always the same. Always the flat economical facts of some crossing held or some element pulled off a hot bank. Never a word of it in her own mouth. People ask me, when the subject of that war comes up, who the bravest person I ever served with was. They expect me to name one of my own, a recon man, somebody who did the loud, brave things I did. And I tell them the truth, which is that the bravest person I ever served with was a woman I mistook for a taxi driver, who ran an ugly patched boat back into a kill zone she had every right to leave, to bring home 11 men who had not once in 2 days bothered to learn her name, and who, when a whole radio net finally said that name like something holy, was already back at her gun, cleaning a dead boy's blood off the steel, asking nothing, saying nothing. Having proven the only thing she'd ever needed to prove, which was that she'd been who she was the whole time, and it was the rest of us who'd been too small to see it.